Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today, we're going to be continuing on throughout the beginnings of the 1800s. So let's get to it. Fun times, fun times. All right, so here is the title, Chapter 8, Varieties of American Nationalism. So remember, nationalism, love for one's country. So yeah, varieties of American love for one's country. All right. So building of a national market. So if you remember that first Bank of the United States charter was going to end in 1811, so minus 20 years, that was 1791. And after that happened, there wasn't really a recharter, so state banks decided to start issuing their own money, their own currency. And same like before, it's going to cause problems. So they're going to be like, people in Congress and be like, we need something. So later on in 1816, the second Bank of the United States, BUS, second Bank of the United States was chartered for another 20 years in 1816. You have a guy, Francis Cabot Lowell, is known for the Lowell system. No, that's education. This is different. And he was the first, he built the first mill for spinning and weaving for textiles here in America. Also, post-war of 1812 economic problems, Britain began flooding the U.S. market with goods. That's going to hurt the U.S. economy because now British goods are better and cheaper than American goods. How does that happen? So there was a need for tariffs. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods, and it's designed. So they create the Tariff of 1816, which is designed to protect American industries. It's a protective tariff, not just a revenue tariff to gain money. It protects home industries. So now you know when you hear about tariff wars for around the world happening against the United States or with China. Now you know why. Why is my voice that high? So there's Lowell, and here is the first Bank of the United States. So building, continuing on. So transportation improvements, the beginning of the building of roads, canals, turnpikes, etc. And the question was, who should fund it? The federal government or the state government? Who has the authority to fund? So you have the National Road as an example. It was built from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia, and that was funded by the federal government. And then you have John C. Calhoun's Internal Improvements Bill, which proposed for federal government to finance internal improvements. And this was on a DBQ back in the day. And it's a quote from Calhoun saying, "Let us then bind republic together with the perfect system of roads and canals." And as we learned last year in honors, world history, that roads and canals were of the very first transportation things to connect cities and rural towns together. However, this would be vetoed by President Madison, and he believed Congress did not have the authority to fund such a project. That's John C. Calhoun, and he, as a young man, and this is him later on in his life. Oh man, he looks scary. All right, expanding westward. So after the War of 1812, many Americans are going to move westward. There were fewer Native Americans with more increased contact with Europeans and colonists, early Americans, disease. And obviously those Native American wars, War of 1812, French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, King Philip's War, need I go on? So with fewer Native Americans, there are less threats, and it's going to be a huge increase in population. So there is a need for more farmland out west because cotton, like tobacco, it was wacky. It exhausted the land, and just like in Europe, just like in England, they needed the what is it? The rotation of crops, right? And because they exhausted the land, they kept growing cotton and cotton and cotton and cotton and cotton and cotton. It exhausts the soil nutrients, so you need more land out west, and we had that. And they needed more because cotton was used for clothing, right? They're also building of forts along the Mississippi River in the Great Lakes because, wars and stuff. And the Erie Canal was financed in 1825, connecting Albany to New York City or Buffalo. And it basically, in turn, if you remember from big history as freshmen, kind of made New York City a trade hub center, as it now could basically connect the trade with all across the Atlantic Ocean into the Great Lakes regions, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, as well as New York. Also, 1821, Mexico gained their independence from España, and they also increased trade. The U.S. saw them as, hey, we got stuff, you need stuff, let's do it. So there was that. So there's cotton. All right, so era of good feelings. Usually after the War of 1812, this is what is described as the era of good feelings. What is it? It's a huge increase in nationalism, love for one's country. So you have it's basically a one political party rule, the Democrat Republicans, because as we learned last time, the Federalist Party kind of died at the election of 1800. It is usually attributed to Monroe's presidency from 1817 to 1825. In the election of 1816, it continued this Virginia dynasty of presidents. Rufus King, however, ran as a Federalist. He only received 34 electoral votes, so he got demolished. James Monroe chose John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State, and this is the Secretary of State is seen as kind of like the stepping stone for the next president, as Monroe, Madison, and Thomas Jefferson were also Secretary of States. And he's going to lead a goodwill tour throughout the United States, and that's where the term era of good feelings is coined. You also have issues in Florida known as the Seminole War, which was an invasion by Florida by Andrew Jackson. And remember, Florida was not a state of ours. And by 1819, you have what's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, where the U.S. gained all of Florida in exchange for the U.S. claims to Texas. The U.S. gave up that claim, and the U.S. gave up its claim. Spain gave up its claim to Pacific Northwest. And here you have James Monroe, and here's this Virginia dynasty of presidents. You have Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. Four of the first five presidents came from Virginia. And here are the later guys. So continuing on, there's a financial panic. So whenever you hear about a panic or depression, financial panic, it's caused by speculation the buying of a good in hopes of selling it at a higher price in the future, which is not going to work out. So you have the Panic of 1819. There was an over speculation on land purchases out west. The Bank of the United States began tightening its credit and calling in on loans, just like we'll see 100 years down the road. And when people got to pay and they don't got money because of speculation, it's kind of like credit. Many state banks are going to begin to fail. And as a result of this depression, many Americans blamed the Bank of the United States, which is going to become a huge issue later on for President Jackson. And there's George Washington saying, "Oh no, panic." It's not a real dollar bill, y'all. Sectionalism and nationalism. So now you get this Missouri Compromise. Missouri MO was part of the Louisiana Purchase made in 1803 under Thomas Jefferson, as Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. And this is in the time of United States history where there are slave states and there are free states. And this would make 12 slave states and 11 free. Now, we can't have that because that just puts imbalance of power where slave states will have the majority of vote in the Senate. And we can't have that. So there is a Talmadge amendment, and it proposed for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Missouri. The southern states hated it, and they saw it as a step towards ending all slavery. So the solution, again, compromise. Missouri was added as a slave state. Maine, which was part of Massachusetts, was added as a free state, and the balance stayed equal, 12 free, 12 slave. And slavery was then prohibited under the 3630 line in the future. The impact, slavery became the #1 issue in national politics until the Civil War, and it helped lead to an increase in sectionalism. And remember, if you think about it, sectionalism is part of a section. So there are various sections of the United States where you have free, slave, Democrat, Republican, all that. So here's a map of the Missouri Compromise. Notice that this 3630 line is, so there will be no slavery allowed above this line. And slavery could be allowed across underneath. And so, but Missouri is above it, and they're still a slave state. Very interesting, very interesting. These are all the slave states at that time. So John Marshall, key guy to know. He was our 4th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And during his reign, the national government became more and more powerful at the expense of the states. Also, he tried to help improve the economy. In one such case, you have Dartmouth College versus Woodward, where the New Hampshire government tried to change the charter from a private institution to a state university. Daniel Webster, Webster's Dictionary, a great order, future senator, argued for the case. And Marshall said that the charter is a contract that cannot be changed, so therefore they can't do that. You also have the court case Cohens versus Virginia, where the Supreme Court could review state court decisions. Again, the federal government would gain more power at the state's expense, meaning that they could overturn state decisions in regards to financial cases and slave cases, et cetera, et cetera. That's our boy, John Marshall. Ooh, I'm sorry. These are all important. These three, big, let alone, Marbury versus Madison, but these also help out. So McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. The background, it has to do with the Bank of the United States. Maryland hated it, so they tried to tax the federal government. Marshall and the court said the states could not tax a federal agency. The power to tax is the power to destroy. Essentially, the Supreme Court states that the Bank of the United States is constitutional. And more on that later under Andrew Jackson. You have Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. The issue was with interstate trade, involving more than one state. Interstate commerce stated that only Congress could regulate interstate trade, not individual states. So more power was given to the federal government. And you have Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, stated that the state of Georgia, could not interfere with native land. However, the decision would not be enforced, and natives would then be forced to leave. Later on, what we call the Trail of Tears. So here's a political cartoon. Get out. New York gave me the exclusive right to operate steamships in New York waters. Wrong. New York gave the United States the exclusive right to regulate interstate commerce. So you have something called the Monroe Doctrine, written primarily by John Quincy Adams, essentially warning Europe to stay out of Latin America, and the U.S. will consider any challenge as unfriendly. So in return, the U.S. would stay out of European affairs. The impacts, short term, weren't really any, because this is around the time where most of the Western Hemisphere, part of the former Spanish Empire, they are gaining their independence. So there's a power vacuum for the United States to gobble up for themselves. Long term, the U.S. would become the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. No longer will they, have to bow down to England as the dominant power or Spain in the Western Hemisphere. No longer will they have to tiptoe around. They can just move in themselves because they are the strongest country around. And here you go. Think of this as like playing a puzzle, and you have the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, and Uncle Sam's hat is on Central and South America, and everyone else in Europe is like looking on like, man. And that shows the clear divide that we won't mess around over there. So the corrupt bargain. So there are 4 candidates for the election of 1824. None won an electoral majority. And although Andrew Jackson had the most electoral and popular votes. But according to the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, the House would then decide on the top 3 candidates. Henry Clay was the speaker, finished 4th, and was out of the running. So being the Speaker of the House has a lot of power. So he threw all his influence behind John Quincy Adams. As Adams becomes president, Henry Clay became his Secretary of State. And as we just talked about at the beginning of this lecture, whoever was Secretary of State in this cycle will become the next President of the United States, as John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. So Henry Clay's thinking, I'm going to be the next president. So he creates this American system where there are protective tariffs, Tariff of 1816. You have the internal improvements, building of roads, canals, turnpikes, and again, the Bank of the United States. Jackson and his supporters would be outraged. And today, as we know, as we've learned, something bad would happen with that election too. In 1824, here you have all the different people trying to gain votes. So continuing on, you have the Tariff of Abominations. Not really much you need to know about John Quincy Adams and his presidency, just that corrupt bargain in American system. In 1828, it raised tariff rates drastically, which was hated by the South and the West because now they have, they have to deal with that with their, agricultural goods. However, the manufacturers in New England, they love that stuff because, they're moving on. There's the clear divide between the South and the West, agricultural economy, agrarian. Here in the Northeast, New England, it's all manufacturing, shipbuilding, all that stuff. Remember? You remember. All right, election of 1828, John Quincy Adams versus Jackson Round Doys. And Jackson destroyed Adams 178 to 83. And there will be future problems to await our President Jackson. So here is the electoral vote. All this yellow is what Jackson won. And John Quincy Adams won the Northeast. So there you go. And that concludes this lecture. So hopefully y'all learned some things and you liked it. If you did, make sure you smash that like button. And we're just going to keep continuing on with our lecture notes. So there you go. As always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.